Okay.
Great.
Okay. You're muted, but okay. Just want to make sure.
There we go. Can't hear you, Shannon. You're muted.
The recording should be on right now.
It is. Yes. Okay, great. Shall we get started? Okay, great. I'll share my screen. So hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Moore, and I'm a special education advocate. I have been doing special education advocacy for more than 15 years, actually. I have two children with disabilities, one that's 33 and one that's 24 now. And I myself am a person with disabilities. So I can't see any of you while I'm talking. So if you could use the chat function to ask questions, and then perhaps Shannon or Allison, you can chime in and let me know if I've missed anything, that would be great. Let's get started. Need to mute.
Yeah. If everybody could please be on mute. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, there you go, Cynthia.
Thank you very much. Okay, so here we are talking about the new IEP and other transitions and the changes ahead. So first, this is just a little bit of information about me. I will pass along the presentation to Allison and Shannon. You guys can look at this at your leisure if you want. But today, our learning objective is to enable you to identify and smoothly navigate the changes or pitfalls that you may encounter in the IEP process as children move through their educational years under an IEP. So we're going to talk about two different things today. One is we're going to talk about the new IEP form. And the second thing is we're going to talk about other forms of changes, because both of them are equally as important, right? And Allison and Shannon, if you could just do a time check for me as well, in case I get off track, that would be great.
Okay, we're scheduled through what time? Just as Cynthia, is it 8? 8 o'clock. All right, excellent.
Great, terrific. So I think when we first start talking about these changes, I just want to give some context as to why the Department of Ed really cares about what the motivation is under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act. What's our motivation in order to help people with disabilities become productive citizens who contribute one way or the other, including myself, right? And so today, one of the driving forces is that we have a labor shortage. We have 3.9 million jobs that go unfilled today, and that shortage is projected to go to 11 million, more than 11 million actually, by 2032. And in between these two goalposts are the current labor shortage and the future labor shortage. Employers are looking for diverse candidates, and they're having a hard time finding them. They want to hire diverse candidates. There are large DEIB initiatives going on, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives to bring more diverse candidates into the workforce, into employers, into corporations, and they're having a difficult time filling that. So why is that? These are the hot off the presses Bureau of Labor Statistic numbers. Unfortunately, 77% of adults with disabilities who are not institutionalized, so these are people who are living some form of independent life or supported life, are not in the workforce. That totals 25 million people. So remember, we have a labor shortage of 3.9. There's 25 million adults with disabilities who are not in the labor force. And then the portion of ones that are in the labor force, only 15% of them are full-time employed, 6% are part-time employed, and 2% are unemployed. And that the unemployed in the United States in the workforce who are adults with disabilities like myself total about 500,000 people. So we've got a tremendous amount of people who are not in the workforce, who perhaps could be in the workforce had they received appropriate education from the beginning when they entered into the school systems. So that leads us to where we are today. There has been a 9-year project, let me say that again, 9 years, to revise the IEP form, right? So just the form that gets filled out, 9 years. And this is the first time that form has changed in 20 years. So the Department of Ed has put a tremendous amount of energy and time and thought and care into developing the new IEP form. They've done a number of things, including looking at other forms across the whole country, looking at best practices, engaging stakeholders in terms of families, professionals, other educators. They've spent a tremendous amount of time and energy in this. When I say the new IEP form, it's very important to understand that it's only a form and then some supporting documents. It is not actually a system. So the Department of Ed made the decision that they were not going to invest money into technology. Instead, what they were going to do is they were going to mandate a form, and then they were going to give out grants to companies and to school districts to develop their own technology to actually support the new form. So they weren't looking to create or be in the business of software. They were looking to just identify what the component should be. And this plays an important piece in the narrative that we're going to talk about today, because in general, there are 3 major companies that do IEP forms, and those 3 companies aren't necessarily in alignment with what the Department of Ed has planned. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. The new IEP form, the reason behind changing the IEP form was the poor performance. Part of it was poor performance that we were seeing in terms of graduation rate, employability, the outcomes of people with disabilities as they move through the educational process. Another driving factor to this is to increase the student input. And one of the fundamental changes you see between the old form and the new form is that the old form centered the whole document around the parent voice and the parent's perspective, and the new form tries to do that around the student voice and the student perspective. Another driving force behind this change was to improve the quality of the IEP. So I'm somebody who is in, I think it's 67 school districts right now. And so I can tell you that there are vast differences between how all 67 school districts use IEPs, the same exact IEP form. There's a huge difference in quality, content, detail, and effectiveness. And last but not least, like I said before, they want to deliver more effective education. So they don't want to just make the document look prettier or the document be more clear. They actually want the outcome to improve. So the rollout of the new IEP form was broken down into pieces. And there's a website, which I can show you guys later if you're interested, or I can send you email links as well, that outlines the progression of what has taken place over the years in terms of rolling out and adopting this form, or moving towards the production and adoption of this form. The highlights of this are that the early adopters started last September. And those folks, what they did, because there was no software that existed for them to use, is they literally retyped or cut and paste the old IEP form into the new IEP form. And I'll show you which communities have been involved in that in just a second. And then literally earlier today, was the Train the Trainer event, where SPED directors came together to have the Department of Ed train them on how to train their own employees, how to train the community, their families, etc., on the new IEP form. And I can show you that or give you a link to that too if anyone's interested. In general, the Train the Trainer piece delivered a training program to SPED directors that results in 3 hours of training. So you go through 3 hours of training, and then you know how to use the form. So just in putting that into context of tonight, we're going to talk about 2 different topics, the IEP form and new changes, just so you know, we won't get through everything that the Department of Ed has gone through today in their 3-hour training. What we'll do is we'll just sort of hit some highlights, and I can always come back later and give you more details. The target rollout for all school districts, all 412 school districts across the state of Massachusetts, is the fall of 2024. Janet, did you have a question? Yeah. Okay. All right. So the fall of 2024. So here are the early adopters that started, weighing in on using the form, and then started converting all of their IEPs over to the new form last year, and doing this in a way that they were cutting and pasting. They weren't literally using a system. They were using cut and paste. And it's nice to see that there's a cross section of different types of towns. So there are cities like Malden and Worcester, right? Very different demographics there. There's school, the Guild School. I can't even say that, the Guild School, excuse me. And then there's even more rural areas like Pioneer Valley, or, out in Blackstone. So very different mix. And we also have a mix between school districts and schools themselves. So private schools, so for example, the league schools on here. So I think it's very interesting that the pilot itself aimed to mix together perspectives of different types of populations. I think that's really valuable to know. Their feedback has gone back into DESE and has resulted in where we're at today with the Train the Trainer. So if you're in any one of these towns supporting people, you should have already seen the IEP form, the new IEP form. Or if you're in a town where somebody's moving in, you should have seen the new form come with that kid moving in as well. So in addition to all the 3-hour training, these are some resources, and I put them in here with the hyperlinks for Shannon to be able to pass along to people, where you can get additional training, like really in-depth training on how to write IEPs, how to do accommodations, how to look for compliance. So how do you actually write a quality IEP? These resources, and there's 2 pages of them, are the same resources that were given out today during the training and are the resources that are going to be shared with school district employees. So if you really want to understand what school district employees should be doing on the IEP form itself, it'll be worth doing any one of these modules. They're all free. They're available on demand. So they're accessible to everyone. So let's talk a little bit about the IEP form. And I think I had laid out several steps. I had said we were going to talk about process, pitfalls, the rollout, opportunities, and some stay put information. So first, on the process standpoint, districts are going to train their own staff. So today was Train the Trainer Day, and then each district has to come up with a training plan for parents, for administrators, for school district employees, so that they all understand how to move from the old IEP to the new IEP. This is a pretty big effort. The Department of Ed has given them sample letters to send home to every parent announcing the new IEP form. They have sent sample IEP filled out so that parents can look and see what it's like. It's actually oriented different than the IEPs of today. It's very landscape based with columns, lots of columns, which frankly is not very good visually. So they've given them communication templates to use with families and staff. They've given them PowerPoints to use with staff. They've given them some guiding documents, some implementation documents, and all those materials the districts have to individually figure out how to roll out between now and the fall of 2024, when every IEP is supposed to be on this new form. Okay. So part of this was district training, part of it was family awareness. The last piece of this that I want to highlight to you is that when they took the old IEP and they designed the new IEP, they did not map everything from the old IEP to the new IEP. So there is not a one-to-one correspondence between things that are in the existing IEP and a place to live on the new IEP. And that's very important to pay attention to. I'm going to show you some examples of that and tell you what to do about that a little bit later on. But I highlighted it here in red, just so that you know that that's the important part to pay attention to. And like I said before, the form is actually available before the technology is. So remember, fall 2024 is the target date for the Department of Ed, but the 3 vendors who do IEP software aren't necessarily aligned to that date. So school districts are in the position where they're going to have to take the information from their old system and convert them into the new system in order to be compliant. That's a pretty big inefficiency, if you ask me. So what are some of the pitfalls of the new IEP form? Now, the good part was the student voice is amplified, but the bad part is the parent voice is muffled. So where we've seen parent concerns, parent input, that sort of information, it sort of gets lost in this new IEP form. So there's a section for the student to talk about their vision, the student to talk about their ambitions and their goals and their targets, but there's very little room for the parent to stand out as a contributing factor in the voice of the IEP itself. I mentioned before that not all fields will map from one to the other. I'm going to show you some examples of that and what to do about that. And the biggest part about that change, about that sort of, not all the fields are going to map from one part to another, is that parents may be caught unaware that things have been deleted from their IEP, right? And I will tell you that just last week, I got an IEP sent to us, one of my clients and myself, and it literally had about a third of it was missing. And none of those changes were talked about. None of those changes were agreed to as an IEP team. And so we rejected the removal of that information. So just because there's not a mapping doesn't mean we have to give up the information that was in the prior IEP. So fortunately, that parent, that family, had me here to support them. But the biggest thing that I'm concerned about are that parents are unaware that they may have things removed. These things may be small or big. They may have things removed. And I'm also worried about parents being unaware that they have the right to partially reject and exercise stay put, or how to do that. So a lot of my slides that we're going to look at next are focused on that particular aspect of moving forward. So let's talk about the good parts first. So here's a couple of changes to pay attention to. First, you'll see in the middle, I've circled method. This part right here, method, how will progress be measured? That's the same question that we've had on the prior IEP, but it's in a more prominent place here. And the expectation now is that every IEP will include very detailed information about who, what, when, where, and how the data will be managed. The progress will be measured. There's actually a separate form, which I didn't include here, which lays out having the IEP team answer the who, what, when, where, how of the progress measurement piece of this. So I'm pleased to see that they're trying to make this more prominent, versus in the past, it was put in pleb A or pleb B of the form. The other piece of it, and you can see right next to it, says, how frequently will this be measured? So one of the problems that I run into as an advocate is that often I will see an IEP that says, we'll do informal assessments and we'll do data collection. And I ask, who's going to be doing the data collection, right? So that's back down here. Who will be responsible for monitoring the progress? I ask how often it will be done, weekly. I ask what will be used, right? Informal assessments, formal assessments, data collection, observations, probing of language, whatever. And that information that an advocate has to spend time and energy doing is now segregated and separate and really prominent here. So hopefully this change will result in that time at the IEP team meetings going away. And hopefully that will really result in our progress being more effectively measured. The one piece I also want to point out here is that the example that the Department of Ed gave was weekly. So the frequency of progress measuring should not be once a quarter as the report cards are done. It should be specific to how often you're looking at the child, demonstrating that skill or acquiring that skill or generalizing that skill. So this could say daily if it was a behavioral goal. It could say weekly like this does for a language goal. There's lots of different ways, but the nice thing is that people are now should be aware that the progress monitoring should be ongoing and not just be as part of the progress report at the end as a one data point. It should be on a frequent basis. The other piece I wanted to bring your attention to is this opportunity up here. This arrow is the goals must also meet each of the students' other educational needs that result from the disability. So if you notice, the sentence above it says that the goal has to enable them to be involved in, to make progress in the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks. This second sentence, other educational needs that result from the disability, means needs that are not in the curriculum frameworks. So these are things related to transition, related to independent living, employment, mobility, socialization beyond what's in the social emotional curriculum. And the nice thing about this edition of the language is that this is another area where advocates often go in and are fighting with the school district, or advocating, I should say, not fighting, advocating at the IEP table to have the IEP goals and objectives include things other than the curriculum frameworks, right? So putting that into the IEP form makes it very clear that the scope of an IEP is not just the curriculum frameworks, right? So that's a real opportunity. Another opportunity, which I love, for some reason, I've been obsessed about ESY for as long as my kids have had IEPs. And the other piece that I love is that we have an entire section where we are calling out extended school year by itself, right? And so here, there's a couple things I want you to notice. First, that this whole section exists. Second, it says, if you read the wording, describe the specially designed instruction, related services and supports that the student needs to avoid regression during the summer break. Now that's a whole other issue. It should say during non-school times, but we'll deal with that later. And to continue to make effective progress, right? So the concept of what your intervention for extended school year should be is actually a mix of whether or not you're stopping a child from going backwards or you're continuing on some emerging skill. So it's nice to see that the wording here addresses both those areas of need. The other piece that I want to highlight here is you'll see that this is just like the other grid. Grid A is consultation to parents or to personnel. Grid B is general education, meaning with non-disabled peers, and grid C is education in other settings. Extended school year is required to be as least restrictive of environment as the regular school year. You can't have a child who has a more restrictive environment during the summer than you do during the school year. Students with disabilities who are included during the school year should be included during the summer. And this has been a big compliance issue in the state of Massachusetts, which I think is going to be fixed a little bit with this form and a little bit with the Office for Special Education Programming's audit that's going on for the state right now. The last piece I just want to highlight to you, the other piece of good news on this form, is something that I've been fighting or I've been advocating for with families for 20 years now, which is that every student who has a disability who attends an extended school year program or services, doesn't even have to be a program, could just be services. I could be coming in for speech. I could be coming in for reading. Every child is entitled to transportation to and from that program or to and from that service. Many parents are told it's only for students with specialized transportation. That's not correct. Many parents are told it's only for students who are in the program. That's not correct. Transportation services to and from the access of extended school year is something that has to be provided to every student if they want it, if the family wants it, and it is not limited to only people who receive specialized transportation. So you can see by just these two examples that there's really a huge step forward on what the benefits that the form will bring to our community. Now I'll tell you about a little problem. I didn't want to hammer these home all day long, so I just put one or two in here and we can come back to them later. But there are some areas where things are not going to map over at all. And that's where we as a community have to come together to support families, to understand their rights and to take action to protect those rights. So for example, this is an IEP form from a particular district, and you can see where I've circled them, the items in red. So I means individual, SG means small group, and G means group. And they have specific sizes. Individual is 1-on-1, small group is 2 to 4, and group is 5 to 8. And this child has a mix of interventions. So they have some academics, which are individualized, and then they have some skills building, which are done in small group. And that intensity is key to this child accessing an appropriate education. Absent those codes, absent that detail, this child could be receiving the information in a group of any size. So this formula, these indicators, I, S, G, and G, The Department of Ed has not mapped those over into the new form. They do not exist on the new form. So this parent with these specificities on their IEP would want to protect them. They would want to exercise stay put on the removal of any of these codes. So if the codes weren't showing up on the grid, then that information about what is individual, what is small group, or what is group needs to be somewhere else in the IEP. It can't just disappear because the Department of Ed didn't think to put it on a form. And this is where we all have to educate parents about what might happen and how to deal with it. So let's say that you were this person and you got your new IEP form, and all of a sudden, individual, small group, all that information was gone, absolutely gone. What can you do? There's a couple of different options. So let's talk about the first option. Let's say you get the IEP and you think it's perfect, absolutely perfect. You are essentially saying that there is nothing that you think should be changed whatsoever in your child's IEP. You are going to fully accept it. When you fully accept an IEP, you essentially give up the right to go back and say that it wasn't appropriate for the child or that the child missed out on some educational benefit. You're saying, this is perfect. I'm going to roll the dice and see if it works or not works. If it doesn't work, I have no recourse. So if I go through the whole year and I fully accept the IEP and I think it's terrific, and my child doesn't make any progress, essentially, and there's some exceptions to this, but essentially, I give up the right to go back and dispute any of that and say you need to give my child compensatory education. So that's what fully accept is. In Massachusetts, in my opinion, IEPs that are fully accepted should make up less than 5%. Uh-oh, I can hear somebody else.
The more frustrated I get, honey.
Who's ever on the phone, could you mute yourself? AB, could you mute yourself, please? Shannon, could you mute that person?
Yes, I'm trying to. 1 second.
I
Sure.
was trying to too, but I couldn't do it. For some reason, I can't do
Okay, I
it.
think they're mute now.
Okay.
Okay, so when you fully accept an IEP, you're essentially giving up the right, there's a couple exceptions, to dispute the education wasn't appropriate and to seek compensatory services. In my opinion, there are very few circumstances in which an IEP is perfect and you should say, this is great, I'm never going to have any problem with it. In my view, in what the world that I travel in and who calls me, this represents less than 5% of all people I interact with. So this should actually be a pretty small experience. The next one would be to fully reject. When you fully reject, what you're saying is, I don't like anything that you just sent to me. So if this was my new amendment, a new IEP, I had an IEP before, I'm getting a new IEP, and you send me an IEP and I think it's terrible, then I can fully reject it. And what ends up happening is the district has to continue to implement the old IEP. Doesn't matter what the old IEP has for an end date, the district still has to implement the old IEP, and that's called stay put, right? If this is your first IEP though, you've never had an IEP before, they send you an IEP and you reject it, you're saying, don't give me anything. So if you have a first IEP, you probably don't want to reject this. You probably want to accept something. If it is your subsequent IEP, you already had one, this is your next IEP, and you really think it's terrible, you can go ahead and fully reject. In my travels, this should also be less than 5% of all the IEPs. So what does that look like? So if we were to look at the IEP as completely inappropriate, that second thing, the fully reject, then you really think that this IEP has zero benefit for your child. You think that this is not even going to meet their basic needs. So you would fully reject. If you're going to partially reject, you're going to say to the district one of a couple things. You're either going to say, I'd like to keep some things from the old IEP, like bring it forward from the old IEP. Or you're going to say, and this can be an and, you're going to say, you left something out. You admitted something. I think that we need to have reading services. You left them out. So I'm rejecting the omission of those interventions. You can use this option, the partial rejection, to reject any portion of the IEP. You can reject a line, a sentence, you can reject a paragraph, you can reject one service, but not all the services. So you can actually pick some things up from before, keep some things that they've added, and reject the things that they didn't put in. So it's a little complicated. You have all those three pieces coming together. Last but not least, you can also say, I'm going to let you do all of this, but I don't think it's enough. That's just another form of rejection by omission. So go ahead and do what you want, but I don't think it's enough. And when you say that, you are preserving your right to be able to go back and claim compensatory services if your child does not experience a free and appropriate public education. So again, 3 different forms. Oh, it's not advancing. Give me 1 second. There we go. So this 3rd form, we're saying that the IEP is close. It's close, but it's not perfect, right? Oops. Sorry about that. It's close, but it's not perfect. So you would check off that you partially reject, and you would probably write in C attached, and you would put in information about that C attached. So again, the 3 options, the ones on the left, I would say less than 10% of all IEPs together show up as fully accepted or fully rejected, and about 90% or more of the IEPs are partially rejected. Now, when people first hire an advocate, what tends to happen is they come to an advocate after many, many years of having an IEP, and they say, we fully accepted everything every single year. We didn't know. And that's okay. If you fully accepted yesterday, you can change your mind today. You are not bound to a year of a decision when you sign an IEP. You can accept the IEP last week, and you can partially reject it this week. And that partial rejection puts a line in the sand as to when you said this IEP is not appropriate, and when you said that if I have a claim for an inappropriate education, it starts today. So I just want to pause there and see if there's any, this is complicated stuff, if there's any questions about partial rejections. We can always come back to it at the end, but I just want to give a moment to pause on that. So we have one question that says, once you state you wish to preserve something previous, like stay put, can a district ignore your stay put? No, they cannot. So you should do stay put in writing. You shouldn't do it verbally. You should always put it in writing. You should have a copy of what you sent to the district in writing. It can be an email, and you ask them to acknowledge the email, send you back a response. It can be something that you delivered and you have proof of delivery from like a mail carrier or something. Most people do via email, and then they have somebody reply to them to confirm the response. A school district has to implement the IEP fully. If the school district does not implement an IEP fully, and I'll get back to the slide in a second, if they do not implement the IEP fully, then a couple things happen. First, the school district could lose their funding. They could literally lose the funding that supports them in terms of being eligible for state money from the state to pay them for their expenses. The other thing is that they can be accused of discriminating against the student. So the student has a right to a free and appropriate public education. The IEP is the proverbial wheelchair ramp, allowing the student into the building, helping the student get into the building. When the IEP is not fully implemented, it's like you've shown up at school and they've taken away the wheelchair ramp. So the mobility ramp. So that is a big problem. And so sometimes what people will do when the IEP isn't fully implemented is they will file a complaint with the state, or they will file for a due process if they can't resolve it in a friendly manner. And other times they will actually file a civil rights complaint about the issue. Let's see. So the next question is, so if you had a 1 to 2 on a previous IEP and the district leaves it out, they must implement it if you exercise stay put. That is true. So if you're, let's say we went to an IEP meeting today, we said, we don't agree with removing the 1 to 2 aid. We're going to exercise our stay put. They send us the IEP later in the afternoon. We're really quick. We respond to it and we send it back in writing and say, I exercise stay put. We're keeping the 1 to 2 aid. Then the district must provide that 1 to 2 aid. The district doesn't get to decide not to provide that aid. They don't have that authority. The parent is the one who makes the decisions about what services to continue or what services to terminate. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the slides, and then we can go back to questions again in a moment. So a couple of things that I just want to mention to you that get folklore, common folklore that I hear all the time and I see on social media all the time, is the first one is that IEPs do not expire. So I hear this a lot. I hear parents being told that, well, the IEP is going to stop if we don't have a new one, or you have to send in the new one or else the IEP is going to stop, or we can stop the IEP if you don't come in. None of that is true. The IEP does not expire. The end date is an indication of the time frame when the district has to have the new IEP in place. And if you don't agree to the changes, the old IEP continues. So if there's no meeting, if no meeting takes place to create the new IEP, then the old IEP continues even past the end date of that IEP. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows that, because that's the #1 piece of folklore that gets repeated out there. The #2 piece of folklore that gets repeated out there is that the IEP team has to meet. If you can't make it, we're going to meet without you. They can't meet without you. So if you haven't disappeared and if you are still around and still interacting with them, they have to have the IEP meeting at a mutually convenient time. And many people fall out of their chair when I tell them, I have had IEP meetings at 7 o'clock in the morning. I've had IEP meetings at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. After school has ended, I've had IEP meetings, I'm not kidding you, at 4:30 in the afternoon. So IEP meetings have to be mutually convenient. Districts in general are constrained by that. They usually happen during school hours, but they cannot meet without you, and they have to happen at mutually convenient times. I hear from a lot of parents who are told, well, we were told it has to be on Thursdays. The team only meets on Thursdays, but I can't get off Thursdays. I only work on Thursdays. The team has to find a way to meet with you that is not Thursday. If you can't make Thursdays, there's not an option. They have to make it convenient for you as well. The other thing is that I hear a lot from parents about how services were terminated without any prior evaluation, and sometimes even without a team meeting. Like parents are told, well, we decided the child didn't need that anymore. Or you go to an IEP meeting and the district says, well, we think that Jimmy should come off with the speech services because he's doing great in our opinion. He's doing terrific. We don't think he needs speech anymore. We're taking him off of speech. Districts can't just remove services from the IEP. They actually have to evaluate the child before they remove any services. And they also have to tell you, they have to propose those changes to you. They just can't stealthily remove things from the IEP, because you have a right to make an informed decision. And if you weren't informed of the changes that were made, then you haven't actually made a formed decision. When we're looking at this new IEP form, districts are being told to make changes to the existing IEPs to force fit them into the new IEP form. So everyone needs to be very careful about reviewing their old IEP against their new IEP line for line to see if anything was removed. Don't take it as an assumption that it wasn't. So moving on, I'm going to talk to you guys about other types of changes. So these break down into a couple different segments, right? And I'm breaking them up by age because I think that's the easiest way to understand it. Oftentimes, when we talk about moving from early intervention into public education, we talk about 2 years and 9 months. And I want everybody to know that it doesn't have to start at 2 years, 9 months. If you ask for an evaluation at 2 years and 5 months, you are eligible to have an evaluation conducted as early as 2 years and 5 months. So all these people who wait until 2 years and 9 months, and then they're scrambling at the last minute, and there's a gap between the early intervention and the start of services after you've turned 3, that compliance issue is coming up, largely because we haven't started the evaluation process early enough, right? So you can ask for an evaluation as early as 2 years and 5 months, which most people don't know. The other thing is that so many families are told that they screened out the child. So we went and we saw your child, we went to the daycare, we went to early intervention, and we've screened out your child. We have no concerns. So your child doesn't get an IEP, we've screened them out. Screening cannot be used to avoid evaluation. So if a family wants a child to be evaluated for special education considerations, then they can say, that's lovely, you still have to evaluate. It seems that many school districts don't know that that is the regulation. So I encourage everybody to spread the word with parents that screenings cannot be used to avoid evaluation. If you have requested the child be evaluated, the school district must evaluate the child at this age. The other thing is that a lot of people are shocked to learn that your intervention in the public school can actually equal your intervention in early intervention. Too many words, too many times using intervention there. Let me say it another way. Your early intervention servicing plan, your individual service plan, can match your IEP if your child needs it. Moving to public education doesn't necessarily mean that you cut your EI services, your early intervention services. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to adopt a formula that the district only has 2 days a week, or the district only has 3 mornings a week. It is what the child individually requires in order to make progress. And here's the logic and reasoning. If the early intervention plan was effective in enabling this individual child to make progress commensurate with their potential, what does the district have that shows that the child needs something different? There isn't any intervention data there. There is no individual proof that the child needs something different. So time and again, I'm just crestfallen by how many families I meet, typically in the kindergarten year, who had a robust early intervention, had that cut down to nothing for pre-K, struggled through pre-K, and now in kindergarten are looking at a more restrictive environment because their child wasn't given intensive services. So again, just to get the word out, it doesn't have to be public education. Your first IEP does not have to be less than your early intervention. Last but not least, the IEP for that child who qualifies must be in place by the 3rd birthday. So not after their 3rd birthday, but by their 3rd birthday. That child who's eligible for an IEP should be walking into services or programs on his 3rd birthday or their 3rd birthday. There should not be any gap in between the start of one and the end of the other. Which brings us to pre-K, K, and the 1st grade. So early intensive intervention produces the best results. Let me say that again. Early intensive intervention produces the best results. If you take the approach that we'll try a little and add some more later, first, you're not acting in alignment with research. Second, you're not setting the child up to have the best outcome. And third, you're likely setting the child up to have a more restrictive environment when they get older. Inclusion also produces the best results even for the most significantly impaired children. The research shows us that the sooner we segregate a child from general education, the more likely it is that they will have a not as effective outcome long term, that they will not be employable, that they will have less skills, that the gap in their educational knowledge and skills and independent living will be greater. So the longer you can delay having a sub-separate program, but at the same time embrace intensive services, the better. The best solutions that I have seen are when there's programs, typically in the K program, that there's a full day K program. Half of the day are the students with disabilities who come in, spend time with the students without disabilities. That's half the day. The students without disabilities go home, and then the rest of the half of the day, the kids receive their intensive intervention. So that leads me to one more point, which is that these programs, K, pre-K, first grade, just like every other IEP along the way, you are not limited to what the district offers. It's what the child requires individually. There are many cases where school districts pay for a child to go to a private pre-K or pay for a child to go to a private kindergarten because they don't have something internally. So they don't have that program inside of the school district. So you are not required to force fit your child into what they offer. And in fact, that sort of force fitting is the opposite of being compliant with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Last but not least, what we see from time and time again when we make these transitions, pre-K to K, K to first grade, or any of the other transitions that we'll see coming up, middle school, high school, 18, etc., is we see that districts tell us that the services have to be cut because of some sort of administrative convenience. What I mean by administrative convenience is that that's the schedule at the middle school, or we only offer 4 days here, or we only offer a AM program. Sometimes in the extreme examples, I hear from parents who are told, well, our speech person can't take on any more clients, or there's somebody who has more severe needs than your child, so we don't have the bandwidth to support your child. None of that is permissible. The Individuals with Education Plan, the Individual Education Plan, the IEP, is designed to identify what this child needs. And then the school district either has to buy it or build it. They don't get to do anything else. Buy it or build it. That's it. So again, things to watch out when you're 2.5, things to watch out as you move through the lower grades. That brings us to middle school. Middle school has a whole other set of things to watch out for. First, you should be very wary of a migration from the grid C, which is the pullout services, to grid B, push in. So if you haven't had push in services in the past, and all of a sudden now the district wants to make push in services for you, they're setting you up in the later elementary grades to be able to fit into the middle school model. It is more times than not what the child individually needs. They are just trying to make the changes so that they can fit into the public middle school. The second thing is that when you go to middle school, most school districts like to offer academic support. Academic support, in most cases that I have seen, is a catch-all, and it's not usually effective for anyone. You have a whole bunch of children, sometimes 15 kids, in a room with maybe one teacher, maybe 2 adult aides, and they have 15 different goals. They're not working on the same thing. And the academic support block is being sold to you in the IEP meeting as that's where Susie will get all their intervention. And if you look at that, you'll say, what is happening with the 14 other children? Because they're not working on the same thing as Susie. So be wary of propositions putting forth that academic support can meet your child's needs. And last but not least, this is like a higher math problem. What happens is the grid will look the same, but the cycle time on the grid will go from daily 5 days a week in the elementary school to a 6-day rotating cycle at the middle school, or 7-day rotating or a 10-day rotating school schedule at the middle school. If the grid stays the same and the cycle time increases, what happens is you're actually reducing the intervention, because you used to have it once every 5 days. Now you're going to have it once every 6 days, or you're going to have it once every 10 days. And these differences can be actually significant. So if you think of it this way, if it was once every 5 days and there's 40 weeks of school, let's say, you're getting it 40 times. If it's once every 10 days, you're getting it 20 times. You've literally cut your services in half by just having the schedule change, the schedule time change. So that is a huge thing to pay attention to. And then we get on to age 14. So wherever you are at age 14, if you've been held back or you've been jumping a couple grades because you're a genius or you're right in the 9th grade, there are activities that should take place when you're 19. The first thing to know is that transition assessments must be conducted for all students who are age 14 or above. And it can start sooner if you have more intensive needs. So for example, let's say that you were significantly impaired, you had medical concerns, you're really complex. Your transition planning should start before age 14. But let me repeat that again. Transition assessments must be conducted for all students starting age 14. There is a huge folklore about this. And as a matter of fact, I was in a meeting with the Bureau of Special Education recently where the person from the Bureau said the wrong thing. The folklore is that transition assessments are only for children who are intellectually impaired or medically fragile. That is not true. So a student who has dyslexia, who has a genius level IQ, should have a transition eval. A student who has speech services because they have selective mutism should have a transition evaluation. The transition evaluation and what comes out of that drives the entire high school experience. It drives your selection of a high school. It drives your selection of courses. It drives your course to study, your activities, your job activities, your community activities. It should drive the entire IEP. So again, all students, transition assessments starting at age 14. The other thing that you might want to consider is that if you have a student who is in middle school or 14, is that if you do not think that your student should be ending education before age 22, like if they should not be exiting education at age 18 in the 12th grade, you need to start rejecting the graduation date. I see far too many times where parents call in May of the 18th year and say, I want to reject the graduation date now. I've never done that before. And it's very difficult for any lawyer to support them and to make a case if you've agreed this person is leaving, the child's leaving at age 18. So you want multiple years where you are on the record saying that you reject the end of this education occurring at 18. So again, the other thing that happens here when you're in middle school or about when you're turning 14, generally at the end of middle school or sometimes in the middle of middle school, all of a sudden you'll have an IEP meeting and they will tell you, congratulations, your child has graduated to a 504. You might even hear some misinformation like 504s follow the child to college, but IEPs don't. So you have to get on a 504 right now. You might even hear he's at grade level or they're at grade level. And so when they're at grade level, we take them off of the IEP and we put them onto a 504. All of that information is false. So nobody graduates onto a 504. The main driver at this age in the late middle school years before you're turning 14 of getting children to graduate to a 504 is that you are being denied the transition assessment and you are being denied all the rights of transition planning and transition activities, which include community, recreation, independent living, can include voting, can include all the different activities in life. So at 14, the world of the IEP opens up wide open to include all these experiences that are leading to adulthood. But if you leave the IEP and go on to a 504, the door closes and you've lost all those rights. You've lost all that intervention, all that support, all that opportunity to prepare you for post-secondary life. because you took the 504 and you gave up your transition rights. So that's why we see so many people, when we look at data, we see all the IEP numbers go down right before the 14th birthday. So that's something to be really aware of. The other thing that happens during high school is that if you're a person with disabilities who's likely going to continue to have disabilities for the rest of your life, you may get a referral. It's called a 688 referral. It's an old code section that 688 refers to an old law that was out there. But what it means is that the school district is just informing an adult agency that you should be coming in 2 years. So the rule is that they're supposed to submit these forms 2 years before your graduation date. My advice to everybody is to try to get the school district to submit this as soon as possible, at least age 16. And the reason why is you can never do it too early, but you can always do it too late. So if the 680 referral does not go in on a timely basis, you could exit the system as an adult or as at age 18, and there could be no services waiting for you because you weren't in the budget of that legislative year. So this referral puts your name and your information into a head count that drives the budgeting with the legislature. So some other things about turning 18. So at 18 or above, let's say you finish your 12th grade now, high school typically is not the least restrictive environment. So the transition programming, if you're 18 to 22, should be in the least restrictive environment. The least restrictive environment for an adult in general is the adult world. It's outside of the actual high school. So be wary of programs where it's only delivered inside the high school. The other thing is that transition is not necessarily that 18 to 22 activities is not necessarily a program. You are not bound to just pick a program, the high school program, the charter schools program. And transition can be individually delivered. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So for example, I have a client who has an individual transition plan, and they have a job coach that goes with them to their job. They have somebody who comes into their house and works on their life skills. They have somebody that takes them out doing job shadowing and job exploration. They've gone to theaters to look at opportunities for employment with theaters. They've gone to acting clubs to see if they want to join that recreationally. All of this is supported as part of their transition plan. So transition activities do not have to occur at the high school. They do not have to occur as part of a program. They can be individually designed. Last but not least, transition, the scope of it includes that employment, recreation, community access, and independent living. There are some students whose transition plan and the IEP includes activities of independent living. So they actually they deliver services or access services in other environments outside of their home in order to learn how to live independently. All of this information, I have never once seen a school district tell parents this information. So all of this information is something that you need to know and to learn about and to spread the word to other people that this is really what you're entitled to. Then we reach the major change, which is age 22. So now you're 22. Before you exit the system at age 22, there should be an evaluation. So you should have an evaluation. You should have paperwork to sign to say that you understand that you're leaving public education, that you've completed the requirements of your diploma or your certificate of completion. It is best practice to actually go get a private evaluation if you can after the child turns age 18, so that you have the adult diagnoses to use for other adult benefits or with your employer or any other needs that may arise. When you turn 22, if you have delayed the acceptance of your diploma, this is when you would accept your diploma, the child would accept the diploma, or they would be accepting their certificate of completion. That evaluation, acceptance of the certificate of completion or the certificate of diploma, or the diploma, I should say, indicates the end of your education, your free and appropriate, your free education. That is not the time to be trying to have disputes about whether or not your child ever had an appropriate education. So if you have concerns that your child has been denied an appropriate education or that you've experienced some sort of injustice in the educational process along the way, in general, you only have 2 years to act upon whatever that injustice is. There are some other rules and regulations around timelines, but in general, it's 2 years. All too often, I get phone calls from people who are 18, families who have children with 18 or children who are 22, who then tell me about all their saga of their terrible experience going back a decade or more, and they want to do something about it. And with very few exceptions, they're not able to do much other than the last 2 years. So I'm just going to check the chat right now because there's a couple of questions and I will see what there is out there. Oh, thank you so much. So we just have a comment that says thank you. And oh my God, it's so much information I've never heard before. I'm glad I made it to the meeting. Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that because I know I'm glad to make a difference, but I'm not glad to hear that because I know that that still means that so many more people need to hear this information. So the other thing that happens at the age 18 mark is the right of majority occurs. So in other words, your child now becomes an adult and the rights transfer to your child. One of the nice things about the new IEP form, I put it in a cut and paste here, is that their rights to decision-making and the process for either transferring that to the parents or the child assigning it to the parents. So a child could say, Mom, I don't want anything to do with that. You just make the decisions for me. That is now part of the IEP form. It's actually deliberately a part of the IEP form. So you'll see it again and again and again, even though your child's 10 years old or 14 or 17, which is terrific. It won't be an oversight. I can't tell you how many times this has been an oversight. The important thing to know about turning 18, though, is 2 things. One is that regardless of your child's profile, when they turn 18, if you are not a guardian or they have not assigned rights to you, to decision-making rights, power of attorney, decision-making rights, or guardianship, then your child is an adult. So I have a January birthday. When I turned 18, I could sign myself out of school. I could have signed myself off of my IEP. I did not have to have any parental approval whatsoever. I am the adult. I make the decisions. So a lot of parents are very caught off guard when their child is approached by the school district and the school district says, you want to end your IEP? And the child says yes and just signs it. And the parents have no recourse because the child is the adult making the decision. If your child requires guardianship or supported decision-making, all those activities you should start working on 2 to 3 years before their 18th birthday. There's lots of different moving pieces. There's evaluations that have to be done. There's lawyers that have to be hired. There's filings that have to occur. There's a very specific sequence of events and timing that have to occur. Public notices have to go out. Excuse me. So the time to start on guardianship or shared decision-making or power of attorney is well before you turn on the 18th birthday. See. Okay. So again, we talked about things that happen at 18. We talked about things that happen at 22, and we talked about the right of majority as well. So let's just go back to that thought. So when you have turned 18, the child who is now an adult, if they haven't assigned decision-making to you or delegated the IEP decision-making to you, has these choices. So as complicated as it seems now, as an adult yourself thinking about your child, teaching your child how to make these decisions should be part of the IEP process. So the IEP process shouldn't just be preparing them for post-secondary life and employment and independent living. It should also be teaching them about their decision-making rights in the IEP process, and should be teaching them about their disability rights and how to exercise them. So for example, the rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act or the rights under Section 504. This information shouldn't be a surprise to your 18-year-old when they're asked to make a decision about their own education. Which gets us to last but not least, So now you've rejected your IEP. If you fully accepted it, nothing to do, right? You'll get your progress reports, you'll take a look at it, make sure everything's good. If you have rejected your IEP or you have partially rejected your IEP, now you must take another step. What will happen is you'll get an envelope, a big manila envelope. They're kind of scary. It's like big and it's a manila color, like that vanilla color. And inside of it has like an official document from the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. And it's got a thick thing behind it. And it says, these are the things you must do. All that means is you have choices about how to resolve your dispute. Those choices vary a little bit if you have a 504 that you're disputing or an IEP that you're disputing. We haven't talked much about 504s here, but I'm just going to pause and do that for a moment in case there's anybody who has graduated onto a 504 or has been on a 504 their whole time. So under the 504, you also have to evaluate before you remove the 504. You can't just take somebody off a 504 because you think it's good. So if they have not been evaluated, the child is entitled to an evaluation before removal. And you can also use your independent educational evaluation rights. If you think that your child should be getting an IEP, you could use the right to a private evaluation in order to dispute your, or to address your dispute. Under the 504, you're entitled to an impartial 504 hearing. Generally speaking, there is two levels. There's one internally, which is usually the SPED director. That's not really impartial. And then there's another one, which is with the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. Usually you're represented by an attorney. You can also mediate. So mediation means that a third party comes together in like a Zoom room and they facilitate the parties talking about their differences and reaching a resolution. That mediation is done for free. You can negotiate, so you can just pick up the phone, talk to people, go in person, talk to them. Or, you know, in some instances, if the 504 dispute is really rises to the form of discrimination, you can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. On the other side of the table is an IEP. So in general, you have 2 years to file for a due process hearing. There are some exceptions to that, which are too complicated to go into here, but there are some rare exceptions. You can ask for a facilitated team meeting, which means the Department of Ed sends somebody in to help make your team run better. You can do that same sort of mediation activity, which is again free. You can negotiate. You can use this special process called SPEDX, which is an independent third party that looks at the dispute, except SPEDX doesn't do eligibility. You can file a state complaint with the Program Resolution Systems, which is PRS, within 12 months. So that's only 12 months. You can take your dispute to court, or in some cases, if you have an extraordinary situation, you might be able to file an ADA complaint, Americans with Disabilities Act complaint, and go after some damages. And there's a famous case that came before the Supreme Court earlier this year on that topic, et cetera. So this is my contact information. And I'm so glad that you guys came. We have 15 minutes left for questions. What can I answer for people, or what would you like to hear that we haven't talked about? Oh, there's a question. Let's see. Typically, when a child reaches the age of 21 or older, they're required to sponsor their own H-1B visa. However, if your child is on the autism spectrum and has not reached age 21, what are the implications in this situation? Unfortunately, that's outside of the scope of my expertise. I would refer you to an immigration attorney. That's what I would do in that situation. Do you ladies have an answer for that? No. Oh, yeah, I would suggest the person contact an immigration attorney.
Yeah, I'd go to somebody who's that's their expertise for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Raman, you could reach out during the, we could reach out to you with a resource for an immigration specialist in Framingham.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Sunny.
That's great. Good question, though. I like the question. I like questions that stump me. It's great. Let's say, what is the best way to make sure the student cannot discontinue IEP when 18 if the child is not needing guardianship? So I'll tell you what I did, which worked pretty effectively. First is I told my child about the IEP process. I told them about the decisions. I told them about the paperwork involved. My kid didn't want to do any paperwork. I shared with them all the information. I put it into their IEP about, I advocated for it to be in their IEP about learning about disability rights and about being able to be informed to make their own decisions. And in the end, my son and I have a good relationship. In the end, my son said, I'm not ready to make any of those decisions. So I just want you to make them for me. And that worked pretty well. You know, in some instances, what I also see is that if you involve the child in the IEP process from age 14 upward, by the time you reach 18, they really do have a sense of what is needed and what a good decision should be made, right? And they still have to have informed consent. So you could be at the IEP table as a guest, and you could be really pushing for, has this child received enough information in order to make informed consent? I've only ever seen like a couple of kids sign themselves off of IEPs. And in general, there have been two situations that have arose. One is that the district ambushed an intellectually impaired child who wasn't under guardianship. And that ended up getting rescinded because it basically was the child doesn't have the ability to provide informed consent. And the second one was, you know, an unhealthy relationship between parent and child, and the child just basically wanted to move out. So that was it. And the parent really didn't have any recourse to it. So it's really good to be thinking about it regardless of how young your child is. And the best formula for success is getting them involved in the IEP process early and often. Absolutely, my pleasure. I didn't get the answer to your question about the guardianship. Okay, so the question was, how do you keep a child from discontinuing their IEP when they don't have guardianship? So your answer to the question about guardianship 18. So a child at age 18 can sign themselves off of an IEP. They are now the decision maker. They are an adult. So if you don't want your child to sign themselves off of an IEP, you can either have them agree to delegate the decision making to you, which is part of a form that they would sign, or you could educate them as to why they should remain on an IEP, why it's in their best interest. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, here's another one. With the new form coming from a student perspective voice, if the 14-year-old students are declining to go to the IEP meeting, will the parents speak for them? Yeah, so I think that that's a very interesting question that you asked, and I am going to share the IEP form just so you can kind of get a sense of what I mean by the voice is centered. So here's the IEP form, and you can see right at the beginning of the form is, you know, student and parent concerns, right? But then you see student and team vision. So student, this year I want to learn. By the time I finish, I want my training plans to be, I want my employment plan to be. So all this information can be filled out outside of the IEP meeting. You don't have to have the child come there to actually fill it out. Children can also participate in their IEP meetings a bunch of different ways. They can, some kids, honest to God, some kids I've seen send in videos. I've seen one kid send in like a singing thing where they did this whole song thing. I've seen kids draw pictures. My own son cracked me up. He did a whole PowerPoint, sent it in the PowerPoint. So kids can participate a bunch of different ways or not at all. And so, you know, if a parent is really, if a student is really adverse to going to an IEP meeting, and then that's not really building their education along the way, I think what you might want to do is create an IEP goal and objective to educate them on their rights and on their needs and how the process works, how the IEP process works and what it does for them. Sometimes students think that IEPs are being done to them, not being provided for them. So changing that paradigm is really important. Yes, and if the student is not going to the IEP meeting, the parent can speak for them, definitely. So we have another question that's in a situation where a medical diagnosis has been provided by both a doctor and a neurologist, but the school assessment is denying the services, what steps can we take? So you can do what we talked about earlier, which was you can partially reject the IEP, and you can reject it for excluding the supports and services in it that should have been provided, that the professionals have recommended. And if you still have a dispute that isn't being resolved, then you have to take action. So you either have to file for due process, like file state complaint, offer to mediate, use that SpedX feature. One of those three options that the options that we talked about previously, which were not here, hold on, which were one of these options that we talked about just a moment ago. One of these options. So you have to use one of these options in order to resolve your dispute. Oops. So due process, facilitating meeting, mediation, negotiation, SpedX, state complaint, one of those options. So there's not a third party that actually resolves it for you. You have to engage an activity to resolve it. Let's see, next question. I had a couple questions about extracurricular, please and thank you. Sure, extracurricular. I'm not sure what your questions are, but I will tell you that extracurricular is still on the IEP form. And extracurricular activities are part of what should be included in an IEP. So let me just show it to you where it shows up here. There we go. So it shows up a couple places. So obviously you have accommodations and modifications. You see how everything is horizontal instead of vertical here. So there's a line for extracurricular activities and it asks for accommodations. So how are we changing the way that the information is being, the instruction is being presented? Are we changing the way that the student responds? Are we changing the timing or the scheduling? And are we changing the characteristics of the setting? So for example, my child needs air conditioning because he's got a metabolic problem. He needs air conditioning. So he might have an extracurricular activity that would be occurring inside of an air conditioned environment. Down here under modifications, we also have extracurricular. So in here, this was going to tell us about how the content, meaning what are we teaching, the instruction, meaning how are we teaching, or the student input, meaning how are we demonstrating our knowledge as a student, how those are going to change. And of course, extracurricular can also be an IEP goal or objective itself. So not just an accommodation or a modification. Are there other questions about extracurricular?
I think there was a question we might have missed in the chat, Cynthia.
Did I miss one? Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I think Donna says I have not seen any area called out for extracurricular in the new IEP, which you just pointed out. I've been trying to get my student the same level of accommodations for extracurricular as they get during the school day, a one-on-one or a 1 or 2, and the district refuses to provide the same level for after school or school sponsored.
Yeah, so I ran into that a lot. And so first I would reject it that it's not in the IEP. So I would reject that it's not in the IEP. But honestly, what I would do is I would file a civil rights complaint. And depending upon the circumstances, I might file an ADA complaint. An ADA complaints Americans with Disabilities Act. And the school is considered a place of public accommodation, and they have to provide access to, and I don't know exactly all the particulars what the student needs, but they do have to provide access to the environment and access to the activity. And then under civil rights, they have to provide the same educational opportunities as students without disabilities, including these extracurricular things. They can't discriminate. So I would actually just reject it in the IEP, and then I would file a civil rights complaint about this issue on behalf of the student and all similarly situated children, so that the OCR can look at everyone who's impacted, not just one person. Yeah, I have found that to be pretty effective. And how the OCR process works, it's a little bit different than how everything else works. So you file a complaint, and it can take a couple weeks for them to call you. They try to convince you that it's a IDA complaint. You tell them it's not. You tell them it's discrimination because my kid can't access the after school activities. And then they will screen it in, and then they will open an investigation and ask the district if they want to mediate. And if you want to mediate and the district wants to mediate, usually you can resolve something like this within a month. Oh, looks like we might have a new question on the bottom. What about personnel? Yeah, so depending upon which the circumstances, right? Like, so for example, I had my son was not able to access the after school program that was hosted by a nonprofit but held at the public school because he required a one-to-one. And the IEP team wouldn't give me a one-to-one, and the nonprofit couldn't afford to give me a one-to-one. So I filed a civil rights complaint, and the civil rights complaint ended up with the district having to give me a one-to-one. I was told that a child with an IEP can attend community college at no cost. Is this true? No, that's not true. There are some programs like so there's a couple different flavors, right? So for example, there are, like my son attended Quinsigamond Community College while he was in high school, but he did that as a dual enrolled student. So he was enrolled in high school and enrolled in the community college at the same time. If that had been part of his IEP, if that had been part of his transition plan and part of his IEP, then yes, the school district could have paid for that. But for him, Mass Rehab paid for it. So he didn't actually pay for it. Mass Rehab paid for it. And that's how he went to community college at no cost. But most of the people, when they're talking about doing something like that, they're talking about the Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Program, ICE, which is usually part of a transition program, versus you're in high school and as a junior taking college classes at the same time. Usually when they're talking about that, they're talking about inclusive concurrent enrollment, and that can be done either for credit or not for credit. So a disabled child can be on campus, and that can be part of your either your adult services or part of your IEP services. If it's part of your IEP services, it can be covered. And so it really depends on what the child's circumstances are. So, you know, if you are a child who you're an adult child who has graduated from high school, is not on Social Security, does not qualify for DDS, and you want to go to community college, you're going to pay for it. But if you qualify for DDS and you have SSI or any of these other things, then you might not. So it all depends on your circumstances. It's not as clear cut as people make it seem. So there's a way to do it while you're in high school. There's a way to do it and at 18 to 22 before you leave the public education system. There's a way to do it as an adult, but there's also a way that you don't get any of it. So it's really hard to navigate those different pieces. It's a whole presentation onto itself. That whole...
is so well said, Cynthia. I have to say, I've never heard anybody describe it as well as you just did. And that is why it is such a difficult question when people talk about transition and they say, oh, it's so nuanced. Thank you for acknowledging that and saying that. And I would love to hear more about that. And I'm sure many people here would. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We are almost about out of time. It is 7:59. So I just want to give everybody an opportunity to wrap up, Cynthia, and you, if you have any final thoughts for the group.
How can I get the slides? Well, I'll send them to you guys and you guys can decide what to do with them. But I just wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight. And again, you know, if you take nothing away from this presentation, please just remember that as we move on to the new IEP, that things will come off of your IEP, and it is up to you to make sure that you exercise stay put so that they do not go away. That is the number one thing to take out of this whole entire conversation. Do not assume that the old IEP and the new IEP are going to carry over things. So just protect yourselves, pay attention to it, and get help when you need to. Thank you all for being here. It's been my pleasure.
Some wonderful feedback to you. You could see all the thank yous and wonderful
Oh.
appreciation. So thanks a lot, Cynthia. I really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much, everybody. You have a
Excellent.
great
Have a
night.
great night, everyone. Take
All right,
good
take
care.
Bye-bye.